everybody, welcome. It's a few minutes past, so let's make a start. I'm Dr. Jess Heron, I'm Chief Executive of APP. Thanks so much for joining APP and the NCMH team for this lunchtime seminar, which I think will be a real whirlwind tour of postpartum psychosis from research to recovery. We'll hear from acclaimed writer and APP ambassador Laura Dockrill about the experience of postpartum psychosis and just why research is so important to women and families. We'll hear from the director of the NCMH at Cardiff, Professor Ian Jones, to find out what we know about postpartum psychosis so far and the many things that we're yet to find out. We'll hear from APP Research and Training Coordinator, Dr. Sally Wilson, about what APP and NCMH are trying to do about these research gaps, why the unknowns are so distressing for women, families and health professionals, and how you can join us in calling upon women, families, professionals, universities and funders around the world to come together to help address these gaps in knowledge about postpartum psychosis. In the second half of the seminar, we'll hear from some researchers about the studies they're working on, including Dr. Jo Hodgekins from the University of East Anglia, who'll talk a bit about a toolkit they're developing to support psychological recovery into postpartum psychosis. Jess from NCMH about the MAM-PP study, a large clinical and genetic study into the causes and how you can help with that study. And Camilla Carr from the Institute of Mental Health at Birmingham University about studies to better understand and make use of the role of sleep. If all goes to plan, hopefully we'll have time for questions for the panel at the end of the session. If you message me in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll see how many questions we can get through by the end. So I'll now hand over to Laura.
Hi everybody, I'm Laura Dockrill. I'm just going to read a piece for you about my lived experience with postpartum psychosis. I feel a bit like I'm standing naked in front of you right now. That's the thing about surviving a monstrous mental illness. It can make you fearless. I appear to have, for good or bad, lost all sense of dignity and shame, freeing me up to do cool, courageous and utterly stupid stuff like, I don't know, share the most traumatic moment of my life here in front of you lot. So here we go, get comfy. In 2018, I lost my mind. I had never experienced poor mental health before. Until that point, I had spent 31 years on the Earth's crust, happy and healthy, with a bright, shining view of the world. Some actual real-life dreams of mine had become realities. I was writing full-time, and the boy that I really fancied since I was 14 years old, and I talk about desperate, had finally just told me that he fancied me back. And then we got pregnant. I felt like I was walking on air. But just hours after our baby was born, during a traumatic and chaotic labour, I began to unravel. One day I was me, and the next day I was not. I woke up on my first Mother's Day in a psychiatric ward. I know, you couldn't make it up. Separated from my newborn, with no idea how or why I got there. My baby son Jet was just 3 weeks old. This almost invisible illness was an assassin, an apparition that nobody else could see. My brain, that was meant to be my friend, had turned on me, was stabbing me in the back, and was now a house of horrors, a black hole, an empty bank account, a phone waiting to ring. My brain was on fire or frozen in ice. My brain that had the upper hand because it knew all of my very darkest fears, secrets and weaknesses was now a hunter, relentless, following a trail of my own blood, and I had an X on my back. My brain was a bear trap, CCTV, rot, wasps. My brain was endless space and time, tinned fish, a speeding motorway. My brain was the drunkest person at the party that had to be carried home by a stranger with spaghetti ankles and shame, a robbed house. My brain was held at knife point, a vulnerable child pop star being aggressively blasted by the flashing bullets of paparazzi cameras, the love of your life kissing someone else in slow motion. My brain was a kid left out of a game by its friends, a missed alarm, a terrible clowning act. Oh, you're so funny, brain. Mascara, tears in rivers, cracking through the pasty thick makeup, ruining my smile. Oh, there you are. I was drowning in a shower. You can't drown in a shower, but oh, yes, you can. And I swirled down the plug hole. I was suffering with the rare and debilitating mental illness postpartum psychosis. PP is different to postnatal depression, affects roughly 1 in 500 women a year, and is considered a medical emergency. Don't worry, I hadn't heard of it either until it tried to ruin my life. There is little understanding of exactly how or why the illness comes on. Its triggers can vary. For many sufferers, as in my case, it appeared out of the blue, and yet I've been picking up these pieces of this shipwreck ever since. Postpartum psychosis is one wild fun fair, except all the rides are smashed together and there's no fun element. I didn't get to choose which ride I went on, and certainly not when I got off. We know too well the depictions of crazy women tropes in stories, the associations with women and madness throughout history, of female hysteria, from spent nerves, overreaction, too sensitive, too emotional, witchcraft, the women in the attic in Jane Eyre, psycho killer villainesses, etc. The list goes on. And there is an overplayed, insidious tabloid media stereotype too of what someone suffering with postnatal mental illness looks like. The faded woman in her washed out, scrubby dressing gown, as Sylvia Plath puts it, stewing in her own sour air. People don't want to talk about this heavy stuff at the best of times, especially not around children, and that makes the silence deafening. Pretending mental illness doesn't exist isn't going to make it disappear. It disarms our power and agency, our language to ask for help, and the tools to recover. Silence only inflames the symptoms, the stigma, and creates an ideal culture for a mental illness to thrive. Shame, judgment, and fear follow fast in the wake, and it's a perfect storm, one that can unfortunately end in tragedy. But it doesn't have to. Postpartum psychosis is treatable. I talk from the vantage point of privilege, being a healthy middle-class white woman with a loving partner and supportive family in the UK, where the healthcare system is exceptional compared to most parts of the world. And yet, in what is meant to be the best times of our life, suicide is the main cause of women in death after the first year of having a baby. And they said we'd be glowing. So can we talk about this now, please? Where am I? There are many dangerous dinosaur old narratives that link women with pain. Our tolerance, our strength, our don't worry about little old me approach, our inability to cry out for help, and overability to take care of others. Childbirth is billed as the ultimate human athletics. For me, to get a gold medal meant enduring the most natural birth without any pain relief or intervention and taking to breastfeeding like an absolute champ. I was scared, vulnerable and traumatized, grieving my old self, a child in a woman's body, trying to become a mum whilst desperately needing my own. Guilt, feelings of failure and shame ate me up like buttered toast for breakfast, but there were also moments where I felt Herculean and monstrous, like I could move mountains or lift cars, channeling some form of hysterical strength, my footsteps thunderous, my heart soaring. In my psychotic state, I was animalistic, primal, raw, also mostly naked. There is a spectrum and my experience is extreme, but after talking about this, yes, I'm now actually a self-enrolled postpartum police patrol officer now. Nobody asked for it, but here I am. It turns out that I really am not alone. 8 out of 10 women struggle in the weeks after giving birth. We are all too aware of the physical changes that carrying and birthing a child can make to our bodies, but what about our minds? Why aren't we passing down this golden information along with all the other tips and tricks and unsolicited advice? It seems to be the bit they leave out with in the what to expect when we're expecting, and so the conspiracy and silence lives on. At the psychiatric ward, they would say, the only path out of hell is through misery. And I'd be like, oh, great, thanks so much, as I began dragging my weary, tired animal of a body down that miserable path of hell. Is there no other way? Can't I just take an Uber? I was so sure I was going to die, that this illness would kill me. When a human being is suffering, it is insensitive to want to, when a human being is suffering, it is instinctive to want to escape pain. It is not cowardly or selfish or weak to want to find a way out of something that feels as though it is killing you slowly. I speak from the heart with insight and acceptance, and don't blame anyone for my experience, but with my symptoms undiagnosed, I was very close to crisis point. What more signs does a person have to show to demonstrate they are clearly unwell and unsafe? It takes an enormous amount of courage for anyone to say they are suffering and struggling in the first place, to only be met with a slip of paper carrying the name of a website, a referral in the distant future, a callback, a prescription for something we might not understand or be frightened of just does not seem good enough. Mental illness is often invisible, but if we could see it, there is no way anybody would say, wait, ride it out, and the fix isn't quick. I have seen somewhere I can't unsee, felt something I can't unfeel, and I don't want to hide or run in shame from that. When I began to unravel my unravelment, I felt a powerful urge to call out my illness as a bully, tear the mask off the killer's face, out the secret, blow the whistle and smash the stigma. People would say, but it wasn't you, Laura, it was the illness. But now I feel like, no, that was me, thank you very much. It wasn't my fault, but it was me. Look what I did to get out of that. I am proud. It is a celebration. It is a love story to my partner, Hugo, to my son, Jet, to my own mum, to myself, to the human condition and its limitless resilience. When Jet was 6 months old, I began writing about my experience, and the day my memoir, What Have I Done, published, there was no running or hiding. I felt like I was walking down the aisle with my illness, arm in arm in pride, to, I don't know, All You Need Is Love by the Beatles, except it was lockdown, so I just had a Radox foot bath and ate oven chips. Love proved to be the medicine that fixed me. Now 5 years away from my illness, I live alongside my experience. Recovery is very precious to me. Keeping my head screwed on is my main priority. I have a little boy that really needs me. Plus, it turns out I really like not being mad. I used to keep myself awake at night trying to make sense of what happened to us. As you can imagine, I had lots of questions. My GP gave me a referral to speak to Professor Ian Jones, who's actually here today, who is amazing. And my biggest question, which unsurprisingly is the most common question people ask when they're suffering with a severe mental illness, is why me? And his response was quite simply, it just wasn't your day. And I can live with that. It just wasn't my day. Parental mental illness is not a fluffy topic for new mums and dads. It is a universal conversation for all humankind about the human experience and what it means to be alive. There are many ways to bring a small person onto this confusing planet. There are many ways to get unwell, but there are even more ways to get better. Asking for help is a place to start. It is the bravest thing a person can do, but the help needs to be there and available for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. Just beautiful descriptions, as always. I think that brings us really nicely to Prof. Ian Jones, who's going to talk a little bit about postpartum psychosis research and what we know so far, and what we'd really like to know as well.
Excellent, thanks, Jess. Let me just share my slides. How do you follow the brilliant Laura Dockrill? Well, be quick, I think, is the key. So I'm not going to take up much of your time. But what I'm going to do is perspective as a clinician, as a psychiatrist, as a researcher, as a professor of psychiatry, on this really important question: is why do we need postpartum psychosis research? Well, we need it because postpartum psychosis we've known about, we've been writing about for hundreds of years. But despite this long history, postpartum psychosis is still incredibly important today. Laura mentioned the high suicide rate after childbirth, and that emphasizes the importance of this condition and understanding it better. So what do we know? Well, I'm going to give you a little flying tour of some of the research that's been done and what's before finishing with my take on why we're in the early days and why more research is needed. We know that childbirth is an incredibly powerful trigger for severe mental illness. You know, women are at 25 times more likely to be admitted in that first postpartum month than at any other time in their lives. We know that the weeks immediately following childbirth is an important time. I wanted to show this slide because this shows our chairs. Fantastic PhD research, which is a few years ago now, Jess, but it's as important as ever. We know that research has told us that there's a link to specific psychiatric conditions like bipolar disorder, and many women who suffer with postpartum psychosis have had experience of bipolar disorder in the past, or may go on to have further episodes in the future. And we know a lot, and this has been a driving force of the research that we've been involved in my group in Cardiff, in trying to understand better how to predict those women who are at high risk. And one of the very clinically useful pieces of work we've done suggests that for clinical services, what happened in a previous pregnancy is a really important predictor of a woman's risk in subsequent pregnancies. And we know that there are certain factors that may be particularly important in triggering illness at this time. And one that Camilla's going to talk to you about later in the webinar is the importance of sleep. And we've done work in Cardiff that suggests that for some women, the sleep disruption that's almost inevitable consequence of having a baby can be an important trigger. And we know that genetic factors play a role in determining this risk. And Jess later is going to talk to you about our genetic studies and the real need we have to get more women with lived experience helping us with that research, so we can really determine those causes of what causes these conditions. And then I wanted to say something about this work from the very brilliant Claire Dolman, who is a trustee of APP, who in her PhD work did a qualitative study of women with bipolar disorder, asking them about their experience of trying to get to navigate pregnancy and postpartum period. And I think what that research has told us is that services need to be far better at helping women through this difficult time. So I've pointed to a number of areas where research has already given us some clues, but there's so much more that we need to know. Why do we need research? We need research because PP is so important, but it's still neglected. And we can talk in the question and answer session about why that may be, why women's mental health in general is such a neglected area. We need more research because there's still so much we need to know. If you think that we know everything that we need to know about postpartum psychosis, if you think that we're delivering to every woman the treatments that are needed, then obviously, then that's fine. We don't need to do any more. But I don't think that's the case. Further research is the only way that we're going to make these major breakthroughs that are needed. And I think we have a fantastic opportunity now to bring together researchers, clinicians, and most importantly, women with lived experience and the kind of charities like APP that help them, in order to make a real difference to the lives of women and their families. And that ultimately is how all of these research studies that you're going to hear about today, and all research must be judged. Does this make a difference to women? So just to finish, before I pass you back to Jess, just a plea, we need your help. We'll come back to this at the end, but we'll make sure we email everybody that's registered for this webinar, with some links so that you can find out more about these opportunities. Please think about it, take those opportunities, join this community, and really help make a difference. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks so much, Ian. That was fantastic and a real whirlwind tour. So just to let everyone know that we are recording the session. So if you want to go back and look at the references for some of those studies, you can. And we've also got a landing page that we'll put in the chat, and we can add some of those links and studies at the bottom of it. So I guess leading on from there, we'll hand over to Dr. Sally Wilson, APP's Training and Research Coordinator, to talk a bit more about how you can help with these studies.
Thank you, Jess. I'm not quite sure how I follow Laura and Ian after that, but I'll try. So my name is Dr. Sally Wilson, and I'm APP's Training and Research Coordinator. So I'm a researcher by background, but I also have experience of postpartum psychosis. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about how APP and the NCMH are trying to address the research gaps and how you can help us. So APP are hosted by Birmingham University and supported by the NCMH at Cardiff University. So collaborations between academics, clinicians, and those with lived experience are at the heart of everything we do, really. So over the past 10 years, interest in PP research has increased hugely. And actually, in the last 2 years alone, APP has supported over 50 research studies, and that's by helping communication between researchers and those with lived experience, supporting lived experience consultation, and then helping disseminate those findings. So we collaborate closely with the NCMH on large research into things like causes of PP, and we'll hear a bit more about that shortly. But APP are moving our focus a bit into the following areas. So genetics and biological studies in PP, sleep and PP, and psychological recovery from PP. So in our next section, we'll showcase some of that research that's either currently under development or has already been funded. So within the APP team, we've carried out various different research and surveys, and that's really focused on understanding the experiences of postpartum psychosis. So what are the information and support needs that women and families need? And then we've developed resources to address those needs, really. And we've also surveyed to look at the changes in postpartum psychosis care over the last 10 years. So on a positive note, in terms of recovery from PP, we've found that the number being admitted to mother and baby units as opposed to a general unit has actually significantly increased in the past 10 years. And also the overall satisfaction with care for postpartum psychosis has increased, which is just great news. We're still seeing less satisfaction with care and a greater time to recovery in those who are admitted in a general psychiatric unit and separated from their babies. So we're just in the process of kind of analysing these data further, and that will help us to sort of inform our next priorities, really. Yesterday, we talked about our research into the needs of antenatal education providers in an Instagram live session with the Perinatal Mental Health Partnership. So just briefly, we surveyed lots of different antenatal providers, and we found that 88% of them thought PP should be talked about with expectant parents, but actually only 48% did. So the main reasons, we were able to look at the main reasons for that, and that was because there was a lack of time for them to cover the topics. They didn't know enough about PP themselves, and they didn't want to scare parents. So from these data, together with voices of lived experience, we've been able to create some resources to help have those conversations with expectant parents. So after I finish talking, I'll drop the link to those resources into the chat box for you. So that's just a very brief overview of some of the things we've been doing in APP. I'm just going to finish now on ways that you can help us. So if you've had personal experience of postpartum psychosis, you can help by joining the APP Lived Experience Network and taking part in some of the research, and then maybe sharing your experiences of what it was like to take part in that research to encourage others. Once you've joined the network, you can join our research consultation panel to help review studies and questionnaires. If you're a clinician, can you encourage patients to get involved with research? And then also you can also join the APP mailing list as well and share with us any questions that you think are important as you're treating women and families on the ground. And then you can also help us disseminate research findings by sharing them and keeping that message going. And if you're an academic, I suppose we hope today's session will sort of cement your interest in postpartum psychosis. So please do get in touch with us to find out how we can help. So we need to collaborate and encourage more research into PP so we can start to answer the questions that we still have about this illness. However, I think I'm slightly biased because I'm a researcher myself, but also I know that without the research that's already taken place, I wouldn't have been able to find the right treatment and support for me to get better. So when I developed postpartum psychosis in 2015, it took us a long time to get the right access for treatment for me. After months of continued psychosis and severe depression and living in what seemed like a daily nightmare, I just wasn't getting any better. So my husband, who luckily for me is a researcher, he spent days searching through all the literature into postpartum psychosis, and in particular looking at evidence-based treatment for PP, and ended up reading a lot of the research from the NCMH team. So without that and coming across APP, I'm not sure I'd be here talking to you today. So to reduce the trauma associated with the illness and to ultimately save lives, we need to know more. So thank you for listening, and I'm just now going to hand you over to our researchers to find out a little bit more about what the research that's going on. So I'm just going to stop talking and I'll hand you over to Dr. Jo from the University of East Anglia.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to come along today. And Sally, thank you so much for sharing my slides for me, because I'm having a bit of a technical glitch today, so apologies for that. So I'm Jo Hodgekins. I'm a clinical psychologist by background, and I'm an academic working at the University of East Anglia. So my background is actually in developing psychological interventions for people with psychosis outside of the perinatal period, with a particular focus on social and functional aspects of recovery once the acute episode has passed. However, over the past sort of year to 18 months, I've been working with colleagues in the NHS and also at APP to develop a project around supporting longer term recovery following postpartum psychosis, as there are currently few specific interventions available for women and families. So what do we already know? So symptomatic recovery is good, particularly compared to psychosis outside of the perinatal period. And it seems well supported by mother and baby units and specialist perinatal teams, which are well received. Relapse rates also appear lower than psychosis occurring in non-perinatal settings. However, recovery does take time, and the impact of an episode of psychosis at this crucial transition to parenthood is important to consider. And I think there's much to learn from research around psychosis outside of the perinatal period, where concepts such as post-psychosis trauma, post-psychosis depression, post-psychosis anxiety are recognised as important areas of treatment. And we know that actually women who have experienced postpartum psychosis are at higher risk of other mental health difficulties following the psychosis. And as has already been said today, it's a hugely traumatic life event, which can have an impact upon someone's identity, sense of self, and it takes, significant amounts of time to process. So next slide, please, Sally. Thank you. So looking into the existing literature and some recent patient and public involvement work done with women and families with lived experience that we've been doing at UEA, these are the kinds of things that women and families are saying about longer term recovery. So, concerns about the future, concerns about ability to tolerate stress, reliving the episode, worries about, is my baby going to be okay? Why did this happen to me? Worries and guilt about never getting that time back, never perhaps feeling the same as people did previously, and actually experiencing quite crippling levels of anxiety. Some people have been talking to us about. So as a psychologist, these are exactly the kinds of issues that psychological interventions will be really well equipped to deal with and to help with. So we did a recent survey of health professionals working with women and families who've experienced postpartum psychosis to see what kind of current support is being offered to women and families. We recruited 100 professionals working across specialist and non-specialist services, and this is what they said. So we asked them what they felt were the main difficulties faced by women following postpartum psychosis. And you can see there that issues like trauma, confidence and self-esteem, anxiety, identity, difficulties with kind of processing what's happened and perhaps coping with the symptoms came out as really important. And when we asked people, do you think psychological interventions could be useful, or do you find these useful, the vast majority of professionals said yes, they thought they were. So we went on to ask what kind of interventions people were currently offering, and here we found that there was huge variation. So CBT for psychosis was being used a bit, CBT for other mental health difficulties, a focus on trauma, some work around parenting, and then a whole range of kind of other things as well. So there didn't seem to be kind of clear guidance on what to do. And people were using their clinical judgment, which is great, but we also need treatment to be evidence-based. When we asked people whether they were adapting their usual practice, the vast majority of people said yes, they were, but they weren't doing that based on any particular guidance. They just felt that these current interventions didn't quite fit and needed changing somewhat. We also asked professionals about their level of confidence in supporting women and families following postpartum psychosis. The average score on a 0 to 10 scale was just under 6. It was higher in people who worked in specialist perinatal teams, as you might expect, but this was the kind of average score there. And when we asked people why or what would help them to feel more confident and what the barriers were, people said they felt they had a lack of time and resources. They really felt like they needed to learn more and have more guidance on what might be useful. People also felt that there were kind of service constraints in terms of how long they were able to support women and families following that episode. So what next in terms of kind of how we move forwards and what we can do and how we can do more? So the good news is that there are existing service structures in place. Have the next slide, please, Sally. Thank you. There are existing services in place and care pathways within the NHS who are well equipped to offer this support. So we know that early intervention in psychosis services can offer support to people for up to 3 years post their first episode. They might not be applicable for all women, but certainly many women would be eligible to go into those services, but don't always gain access. And I think in our survey, we found that around 15% of professionals were referring into these services. And my guess is that, you know, it could be that more women are eligible than that. And of course, we've got the rollout of perinatal mental health teams who, with more rollouts and current guidance, are going to be able to potentially offer support to women for up to 2 years after birth. So we have the structures in place. We perhaps just need more guidance on what to offer. And more good news is that there are lots of evidence-based intervention components that could be borrowed from the existing literature on psychosis, on bipolar disorder, on anxiety, depression, trauma, that could be borrowed and adapted to meet the needs of women and families following postpartum psychosis. But we do need to further understand exactly what issues women and families face in the recovery process, how we should be tailoring these interventions, and who is best placed to deliver them, and how we upskill those professionals to do that, which is where our project comes in. So what we're doing is we're currently applying for some funding to try to build an intervention that supports longer term recovery following postpartum psychosis. Based on what we already know, it feels important that such an intervention is built on a really solid foundation of a good human connection, understanding, and a good holistic assessment of the range of issues that women and families are facing. But then we can perhaps take a bit of a toolbox approach and match and adapt the existing evidence base and components from different treatments to meet the needs of women and families. And what we're hoping to do is to, within our research project, learn more about what components might be best placed to support women and families, how we can adapt these, and how we can train professionals to do so. And we're looking forward to continuing to work with APP to hopefully deliver on this project. So if you'd like to hear more, here are my details, and I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jo. I think this work is really exciting. So yeah, we're really pleased to be able to support on it. I'll now hand over to Camilla to talk a little bit about sleep and postpartum psychosis.
Thank you. So hi everyone, my name is Camilla Carr and I'm a research associate at the University of Birmingham, and I'm currently working alongside Isabel Morales on sleep and postpartum psychosis research. So the current research base on sleep and postpartum psychosis is quite limited. However, there is research that suggests that sleep problems during the postnatal period may increase risk of experiencing postpartum psychosis. So firstly, researchers found an association between longer labours and nighttime deliveries with experience of postpartum psychosis as a result of sleep deprivation. Secondly, women with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder have been found to have an increased risk of experiencing postpartum psychosis. So sleep disruption is associated with an increased risk, but also having a diagnosis of bipolar disorder further increases the risk, so kind of makes them more vulnerable to experiencing the condition. And finally, there have been a couple of qualitative research studies, mainly using semi-structured interviews, which have been carried out on both women postpartum and nurses who work in psychiatric wards who look after women that have been admitted with the condition. And then both have reported that sleep problems and insomnia were prevalent during the postpartum period and may be symptoms of postpartum psychosis. So this research area is particularly important as postpartum psychosis in general is highly understudied. So there's limited evidence on the triggers or risk factors associated with experiencing this condition. Particularly sleep as a risk factor is still not that well understood, despite it gaining increased attention. Although there's research noting an association between sleep and postpartum psychosis, there's still some contradictory evidence, such as sleep quality not being significantly different between those experiencing psychotic-like symptoms postpartum and the general postpartum population. Also, different research studies have focused on different types of sleep. So some are focused more on sleep disruption, some are focused more on insomnia. So it's important to have measures on a variety of sleep measures, on sleep problems, to get a holistic view of sleep in relation to postpartum psychosis. So I'm just going to briefly talk about our research study that we're currently recruiting for. So we're researching the importance of sleep as a risk factor for postpartum psychosis, and we're working in collaboration with APP. So if any women who have previously experienced postpartum psychosis and have been in contact with the charity and would like to take part in the study, we would be very grateful. So the research study will consist of two parts. Firstly, you've got a series of mental health and sleep questionnaires, which will take approximately 30 to 40 minutes to complete. And then secondly, you'll be taking part in a focus group if you consent to it. And this will consist of a small number of participants and the researchers. There's probably about 4 to 5 participants and about 2 to 3 researchers. And we'll talk more about your experiences of postpartum psychosis and the risk factors that you think were most important, and feasibility of a future cohort study following mothers and their children after birth. And that part will take approximately 60 to 90 minutes to complete. And we've also got a £30 compensation if you take part, if you complete both parts of the study, or if you decide you only want to take part in one part over the other, we'll pay you £15 for completion of that. So yeah, if you're interested in taking part in this research study, if you could please email either myself or Isabel, and we'll get back to you with more information. And also feel free to email if you have any questions or concerns relating to the study. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Camilla. We'll give the link to the landing page as well, so all the details of the researchers will be on there if you didn't get time to catch it. So now hand over to Jess from NCMH to talk more about the MAM-PP study.
Thank you. Let me just share my. Does that work? Okay, great, thank you. So yes, my name is Jessica. I'm a research assistant and PhD student at the Centre for Neuropsychiatric Genetics and Genomics at Cardiff University. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Mothers and Mental Health study that we're running with the NCMH at the moment. So this project is mostly a genetic study, and one of the major problems that we're seeing in genetic research is a lack of representation. So the majority of people who take part in research are white and from high-income countries. And so this is something that we're really hoping to address in the long term. And to do this, we created the International Postpartum Psychosis Consortium. And we're a mix of clinicians and researchers, and we now span across North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, as well as indicated on this map. And for this project, working closely with our colleagues in Malawi and India, we tried to develop a questionnaire which could be used to identify cases of postpartum psychosis in different cultural contexts. So in each of these countries, and with help from APP, we talked to people with lived experience of postpartum psychosis, family and healthcare professionals, to make sure we were asking the important questions and that we were wording them correctly as well. And we also asked people about their understanding of postpartum psychosis as a sort of way of checking whether the experience we're studying is consistent across these 3 countries. And although there were a lot of social and cultural differences between these countries, what we were able to do was develop a set of questions together with our stakeholders across these countries, which tap into a similar set of experiences, which could then hopefully be defined as postpartum psychosis. And this is the questionnaire that we're now using in our Mothers and Mental Health study. So far, we've recruited over 850 people with experiences of postpartum psychosis, which is amazing, but we still need the help of many, many more women to really understand this condition. And that's partly because genetic research tends to need many hundreds, if not thousands of samples, and people's experiences as well of postpartum psychosis can be so different. And so we're really hoping to increase these numbers over the next few years. And again, if you'd like to be a part of this effort, we'd really urge you to click on that link, which will be sent out after the webinar, to register your interest and take part in this study. So to give you a bit of an idea of what is possible with genetic research, we have previously run analyses comparing the genetic risk profiles of people with bipolar disorder who have and haven't experienced postpartum psychosis, and people who've experienced postpartum psychosis as the first onset of any psychiatric illness in their lifetime. And what we found is that for people with bipolar disorder, they have very similar genetic risk profiles, regardless of whether or not they experience postpartum psychosis or not, and that this profile overlaps but is slightly different from people who experience first onset postpartum psychosis. And specifically, people with bipolar disorder seem to have a higher genetic risk for clinical depression than people with first onset postpartum psychosis. And what this maybe suggests is that there's a lot of genetic overlap between the 2 conditions, but there is an important distinction as well, which needs to be considered. And this is actually the first evidence to show this, and is now being used as evidence to inform the diagnostic criteria for postpartum psychosis in future diagnostic manuals. But again, we really need those extra studies to replicate this research, to understand the relationship between these experiences better, and to better understand the conditions as a whole. And ultimately, what we hope to do with this is to find clues to understand the biology of these conditions, improve risk prediction, early intervention, and recovery for women with these experiences as well. So thanks very much for listening. And just to finish with a few thank yous to all those who've been involved in the research.
Thanks, Jessica. It's so interesting. So I think we've got about 15 minutes to look at some questions, and there've been quite a few, I think, coming in while we've been talking. There was just, I wanted to kick off with one from me, really, aimed at Laura and Sally, which is from your own experience of postpartum psychosis. What were the unanswered questions that were most frustrating for you and your families? Because I think that's really important for researchers to understand.
Can I go first? I've only got 15 minutes though, so I could go on for a long time. No, I think from my personal experience, as I said, my husband did a lot of research trying to look at the best evidence treatment. So there was a lot of stuff that we just didn't know and didn't get access to that information at the time. But over the last few years, really, I've had reflections on the things that I'd like to have known. I guess the recovery process, so that's what's so important about that, beyond the kind of symptoms subsiding and how long things take to recover, and that kind of individual recovery process. But I always have this question of, is postpartum psychosis really out of the blue? And that's just because it's my personal experience that it happened completely out of the blue, no psychiatric history. And I guess that's what, ultimately the genetic studies are looking at is, what are the reasons for postpartum psychosis? So for me personally, it was, is it really out of the blue, or is there something underlying that's going on? And why are some women more vulnerable than others? So that's always been my big question, I think. So.
I think I'm the same with Sally, that this could be a whole hour in itself. I think from spotting it, I felt like the illness is so fast acting that I could have saved a lot of time rather than kind of running around. Like, I was explaining my symptoms to the GP. I don't prescribe blame to the NHS, but I kind of wish if somebody had even raised the word psychosis, that would have sped things along. I was admitted to general psych, so there was, it was interesting listening to everyone's talks, because it was these kind of sirens going off, like, gosh, like no one even really, they were still calling it depression even in the psychiatric ward. And then exactly as Sally says about the recovery time, will I ever be myself again, then having a newborn to care for on top of trying to recover when probably I needed to go to the Maldives for 2 years. That was quite stressful. And also learning, finding CBT. I mean, CBT is my #1 boyfriend now, but learning that actually leaving it alone was probably the best thing, rather than unraveling and letting the questions wander around my brain, just going, exactly as Ian said, it is what it is, it's happened. Acceptance was so key, rather than trying to pick at the scab. Actually, I wish someone had told me that earlier, because a lot of time was spent thinking it was me, and guilt and shame and all of that was actually the biggest symptom of the illness itself, was the shame. So I think there needs to be the protection after the illness, after you've had this explosion, someone to help you pick up the debris that's left afterwards.
Thanks, both. There's a question here from Sarah that I'll direct to Ian. It's about the data and research on what women are diagnosed after postpartum psychosis. And she's noticed that people are often diagnosed with bipolar. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about whether women with postpartum psychosis are diagnosed with bipolar. And probably that will feed into a bit about the diagnostic problems and inconsistencies in postpartum psychosis.
Yeah, there are issues in mental health and psychiatry in the labels that we use, and the labels are never perfect, and they're always have issues, and no better is that, where is that more the case than in this area of perinatal mental health, I think. Undoubtedly, as I mentioned in the talk, women who have a vulnerability to bipolar disorder, there does seem to be a relationship with postpartum psychosis. That's not to say, however, that every woman with postpartum psychosis has a bipolar disorder. What we know from the data is that about 50% of women have a history of mental illness before they have their postpartum psychosis, and often that's mood disorder or bipolar disorder in nature. And what we know is that for women who have postpartum psychosis, perhaps around 50% will go on and have further episodes of illness, and often they are kind of bipolar-like illnesses in nature. But that means that for some women, they may have only experienced postpartum psychosis and and never go on to have further episodes of illness. So I think it's important that we recognise that link. We recognise that link to bipolar disorder, particularly so that we can, work with women with bipolar illness, recognising that they're at high risk, and working, finding the best ways to reduce that risk. But I wouldn't want people to think that there's 100% overlap between those two conditions. Does that answer that question, Jess?
Yeah, I guess related to that is the problem with diagnosis.
Yeah.
And so what do NCMH regard as the definition of postpartum psychosis, and how have you arrived at that?
Because the classification systems that have been mentioned today in the webinar, things like the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM and ICD-10, don't really do postpartum psychosis justice. There are a number of us, including APPs, with APP's help, that are trying to do something about that and get this condition properly recognised in those systems. And that's one reason why there's such a neglect of research in this area. But for our work, we take quite an inclusive definition. So we're looking for episodes of really severe mental illness. certainly women who have the new onset of a psychotic episode in that immediate postpartum period. So those are psychotic symptoms like hearing, like believing things that aren't true, hearing voices, having hallucinations, but also women that have significant episodes of mania, high mood episodes we'd include in that definition as well. So exactly where you put the boundaries around these conditions can be difficult, but that's true for medicine in general. And, you know, just because there are difficulties at the boundaries doesn't mean that the core of the concept, you know, postpartum psychosis is one of those conditions where we see a woman, you know, like Laura, like Sally described, who, you know, very in that immediate postpartum period has this kind of onset with kind of rapid progression of a new severe mental health episode. You know, that is clear that that's what we call postpartum psychosis.
Thanks, Ian. Probably got time for 2 more questions. So there's one here from Wilhelmine saying postpartum psychosis is often called rare, but is 1 in 500 really that rare? I don't know, should I come to Sally to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, okay. I guess it is less common than other perinatal mental illnesses. We know that it's, you know, it's less common, but in terms of, you know, the stakes are pretty high in terms of it is one of the most serious complications of childbirth and pregnancy in terms of it being a medical emergency. So I sometimes have issues with calling it rare because, you know, we don't want to scare people and say it happens loads, but it's not that rare is my feeling. So that's my personal opinion, but in terms of the stats, someone else might want to comment on that. So
yeah, does anyone else want to add any more to that?
And for those women that suffer, it's, you know, yeah, whether it's 1 in 500, 1 in 1,000, whatever it is, for them, it's the most important thing that they've experienced in their life, often up till now. So, yeah, and I do think sometimes by calling something rare, we diminish its importance. So I agree with the questioner, you know, that compared to many other things we worry about hugely in the perinatal period around pregnancy and childbirth, you know, that loads of money and expenses spent, you know, this is an area that's still underplayed, I think.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. So there's a question here. What are the most common forms of treatment and care or support for postpartum psychosis? And what's proving the most successful at the moment? Should I come to Ian first, and then maybe Jo can talk a little bit about psychology and maybe Sarah about peer support?
So I think that's a really important point to make, is that all of the aspects of care are really important here: the psychological, the social, the practical, as well as the kind of medical treatments. In the initial phase of severe illness, this, you know, and I hope Jo would agree with me, this isn't an illness that psychotherapeutical approaches are going to be the mainstay of treatment initially. Yeah, medical treatments like drug treatment. Yeah, and even we know that ECT can be a really effective treatment for many women with illness at this time, are really important. But that's not to downplay the importance of psychological treatments that Jo might want to say something more about in the longer term, particularly helping women. And Laura and Sally talked really, you know, passionately about this. You're coming to terms with, you know, you're dealing with the impact that this illness can have on women, and Laura talked about the guilt was a major factor. So I think, you know, we need to think about this, you know, in those initial phases and the treatments that are needed then, but the longer term psychological treatments, I don't think we do particularly well. You know, I think that's the area of treatment, and APP's researchers back that up, isn't it? That's the area that women feel that they need more help with.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. You know, I mean, in the acute phase, and actually a lot of the women that I've spoken to in the kind of preparation of the project that we're developing have said, actually, the place for this is not in the acute phase. You know, in the acute phase, actually, you know, we needed to be admitted into hospital. We needed those medical interventions, and I think I would agree with that. And that, I think, is sort of consistent with psychosis outside of the perinatal period as well. But in terms of kind of longer term recovery, making sense of what has happened, dealing with the fallout of the episode, you know, in terms of the impact of that on sense of self, on anxiety, on low mood, guilt, shame, all of these kinds of things. These are all things that psychological interventions are well equipped to support with. In terms of what the evidence-based treatment would be, I don't think we know. So NICE guidelines directs clinicians to the guidance on treating psychosis, and the guidance there is around CBT for psychosis, which I think is potentially quite different, actually, because it's about often treatment resistant psychosis, where people are still very much dealing with the symptoms of the psychosis, and I think in the case of postpartum psychosis, those symptoms tend to, not necessarily always, but tend to recover, you know, fairly rapidly in response to medication. So I guess that's why we want to do this research, really, to sort of find out, are there interventions out there that could be used but may need to be tailored? Do we need something new that is specifically tailored for postpartum psychosis? I think we'd certainly need to adapt our current interventions that we would use for psychosis or other mental health difficulties, just to account for the fact that actually this is a very unique period of life, and you know, people are also looking after a baby and you know, thinking about the wider impact on the family as well. So I think there's great potential for psychological interventions, but I think we need to know more in terms of what works best and for who.
Sal, 1 minute on peer support.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I think I just agree with everyone. I needed that medication in the first instance. I had a lot of psychological input. I had a clinical psychologist throughout my psychosis and my recovery. And then I came across APP, and I was assigned to a peer supporter, and that's kind of, I felt like that's where my recovery started, really, from it all. And it probably took a couple of years, maybe best part of 5 years for me personally to recover from it. So yeah, and peer support is just huge in the sense of firstly meeting other women that have been through it, so you don't feel so alone, and then also just being able to talk about anything related to, whether it's not related to illness, but just anything, and that mutual understanding, yeah, it's a massive part of my recovery. So yeah.
Thank you. So I just want to thank all of our speakers hugely for coming today, and for raising awareness of the need for more research. We hope, whatever your background, you'll be persuaded to join us in our aims of increasing PP research in whatever ways you can. To sign up to any of the research today, there's a web page that's in the chat, which is www.app-network.org from research to recovery, and also we'll send an email out to everyone registered with all the links as well. So yeah, just thanks so much for joining us today in Maternal Mental Health Awareness Week, and enjoy the rest of the week and your bank holiday. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thanks, Jess. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.